In today's episode, we have gotten our hands on the all-new Buick Regal. For 2018 and now for 2019, the Regal is now in its 6th generation. If this looks familiar to some of our viewers from Australia or from Europe, that's because this is sold in other markets under a different name. In Europe, you'll find it as either the Vauxhall insignia or the Opel insignia, and of course, in Australia, it is sold as a Holden. The big news for this generation of the Regal is that it's gotten a little bit larger than before, and it's no longer available as a sedan. I know this looks like one, but it is technically a hatchback this time, although Buick is calling it a Sportback, very much like Audi with the A5. The overall styling of the Regal definitely fits into the modern Buick family because Buick really has been going for more of a European flair, as is obvious by the fact that most of the modern Buick models have an Opel counterpart. Opel used to be the best-selling General Motors brand in Europe, but they've actually recently sold Opel off, and it actually is no longer part of GM. But this vehicle, and most of the modern Buicks actually, were still designed in tandem with those European entries. And that really is obvious not just in the way that they look, but also in the way that they drive. Our model has full LED headlamps. These are optional on the Regal, but they're standard on the GS trim. And you'll notice that we don't have fog lamps down below, but we do have well-integrated parking sensors. In terms of overall length, this is 192.9 inches long, or right about the same overall length as a Toyota Camry. It's about 1 inch longer than an Acura TLX, about 3 inches longer than a Kia Stinger. Versus the previous generation Regal, this has actually grown considerably. This is about 3 inches longer than the previous model, and that's because this is now very closely related to the Buick LaCrosse, although the outside definitely looks different. Much like the Acura TLX or the Lexus ES, this is a front-wheel drive vehicle to start. It is obvious when you take a look at the overall side proportion, especially right up here by the hood. This is a little bit different than the Kia Stinger, which is actually the only rear-wheel drive entry in this small and somewhat unusual segment. Even though the Regal has a fairly long hood, the overall proportions of the Regal are still that of a front-wheel drive vehicle. That's because this does start out as a front-wheel drive vehicle if you don't choose the all-wheel drive option. That's very similar to the Avalon, the TLX, the Lexus ES, etc., but a little bit different than what we see in the Kia Stinger. And it's really noticeable when you look at the wheelbase, because even though this is longer overall than the Stinger, the front wheels and the rear wheels are actually a little bit closer together. We've moved to the shade so you can better see what's going on with the tail lamps. These are partial LED modules, so we have LED light pipes running through the tail lamp, but the turn signal that you'll see over here on this side is actually an incandescent element. As we saw up front, the GS badging is relatively discreet back here, and then we have 2 integrated exhaust tips at the bottom of the bumper. The Buick logo hides the release for the Liftback. We press the bottom of this and then we actually pull on the hatch itself in order to bring it up. This is a little bit different than what we see in Volkswagens. If you press the top of the Buick logo, it really does nothing. So this doesn't hinge and become an extra handle. We just lift it open right like that. There are a variety of different engines offered under this hood in Europe, but in America we get just 2 engines. Things start out with a 2-liter 4-cylinder turbocharged engine that produces 250 horsepower and either 260 pound-feet of torque or 295 pound-feet of torque, depending on whether you get front-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. Then we have this engine right here, which is a 3.6-liter V6 naturally aspirated engine producing 310 horsepower and 282 pound-feet of torque. This ties with the Buick LaCrosse for being the most powerful Buick available in America. This engine is mated to a 9-speed automatic transmission and all-wheel drive, and interestingly enough, the base engine gets a 9-speed automatic in front-wheel drive format, but an 8-speed automatic in all-wheel drive format. We're really not sure why that is. I suspect that General Motors may be limited in the production ability of the 9-speed automatic, so they aren't offering it in that particular model down there just to sort of help inventory out. Bearing in mind that we are driving the top-end GS trim, front seat comfort is excellent. Although I do have to drop these seats down to 9 out of 10 points because this is competing in a very, very competitive segment, and we do find slightly more comfortable seats in some of the competition. We do have a wide range of adjustability, however, including a 4-way adjustable lumbar support, inflatable side bolsters, and a manually extending thigh cushion. We also have a manual tilt telescopic steering column with a large range of motion, and the passenger seat has exactly the same range of motion as the driver's seat. That's something that a lot of even luxury cars leave out. The reason I dropped the seat down just a little bit is because the overall shape of the seat back is a little bit tight on my shoulders. The overall form just doesn't let me nestle back quite as much as I would like in this particular seat design. In addition to that, we do have a massaging functionality in this seat, but it's a little bit different than what we see in most of the luxury entries because it just seems to inflate and deflate the airbags that are associated with the lumbar support in this seat. There is no anti-fatigue mechanism at the bottom, and there's no massage going on at the top of the seat. Hopping into the back seat, we find about the same kind of combined legroom that we find in the Kia Stinger. Interestingly enough, it's actually the exact same number. That's because even though the Regal is a little bit longer than the Stinger, it actually has a shorter wheelbase, and the wheelbase does affect legroom. It also appears that Buick has decided to prioritize cargo capacity a little bit more than overall combined legroom, which is not really a problem because we have a ton of it back here, about 4 or 5 inches sitting right here behind myself. Now, because of the overall shape of the Regal, headroom is not going to be as accommodating as some of those more comfortable entries, with which I suppose you could make this a comparison. In terms of overall legroom, this is significantly ahead of the Acura TLX and of course the Audi A5. The A5 is notably smaller than this. Like most of its direct competition, this is a 5-seat vehicle, so we do find a center seat belt right there. And like many European vehicles, you can get a 40-20-40 folding rear seat back. Thanks to the transverse engine layout and of course the liftback design, we have an enormous cargo area back here, and that's one of the big benefits to this overall format. You'll find 31.5 cubic feet of cargo capacity behind the second row seats. This cargo area is quite large when you're comparing this against its natural competition, like the Kia Stinger at 23.3 cubic feet, or a Toyota Avalon at 16 cubic feet, or even an Audi A5 at 21.8, but also a station wagon like the Volvo V60 wagon, which actually has less cargo capacity than this at 28 cubic feet. In addition to this being a large cargo area, it's also very practically shaped. So I can definitely put 22-inch roller bags like this in the upright position at the back of this cargo area, right up there against those rear seats. I can even put them in this sideways position and still close the hatch. Of course, like most vehicles that use a liftback design, the cargo capacity does include the area above this removable tonneau cover, but the removable cover is actually quite high up in the trunk. It comes to right about here, so you definitely still have a great deal of room left. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that we are in the GS trim, so things are going to be a little bit different in the other trims. The driver and front passenger get fixed height shoulder belts and fixed headrests on these very interestingly designed sport seats. This is the first time that this particular German seat manufacturer has been featured in a Buick model. We have these sort of faux openings right here on the seat to imitate what a 5-point harness seat would look like. We have a GS logo right there in the middle of the seat, and then combinations of perforated and non-perforated leather. These seats do offer heating and ventilation, and you'll notice that we have fairly aggressive side bolstering on the seat bottom and seat back cushion. Again, these bolsters are adjustable. The front doors feature a combination of hard and soft touch materials, which I actually found a little bit surprising. I thought that there would be a few more soft touch materials going on this door. We have a soft touch upper section right here that you can rest your arm on, a soft touch armrest with padded section right there behind it, but the bulk of this door body itself is actually hard plastic, and that includes this area right here between this carbon fiber effect trim and the rest of that door panel. Moving from the doors over to the dashboard, we find a speaker right there on the door next to the A-pillar, and then an overall design that is very similar to other Buick models sold in America. We have a lot of soft touch materials going on the upper section of the dashboard, and then some after stitching to give that a little bit extra flair. And then we have hard plastics lower on the dashboard below sort of this line right here. In the middle of the dash, we find a color touchscreen infotainment system. This supports Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. The instrument cluster is similar to ones used in other GM vehicles. We have a physical tachometer on the left, and then physical dials for the coolant temperature and fuel level over here on the right. Everything else that you see is being delivered by a color LCD that fills out portions of the 2 dials on either side. So oil temperature over here on the left and battery voltage over here on the right, with that large speedometer in the middle. This is configurable, although it's not quite as configurable as displays that we see in the Cadillac lineup. The steering wheel is leather wrapped. It's also heated with this button right over here on the steering wheel. It's a flat bottom design with aggressive sport grips up top and on the bottom as well. You can see that the bottom portion of the wheel is thicker than the top portion up here. This is really a very comfortable steering wheel. The bottom spoke is split right like that, and then each of the side spokes contain buttons for the infotainment system or for the radar adaptive cruise control system. We have the radar adaptive cruise control buttons right over here, along with the dedicated phone button and voice command button. And then on the right side, we find track up, down, Then on the right side, we find track forward, backward, volume up, down, and then this button arrangement controls that multifunction instrument cluster. Again, one thing that you won't find on this steering wheel are paddle shifters on the back. I really wish that Buick would address that, because that really is the only thing I think that this interior is missing. In case you're wondering, this is what the trim inside the GS looks like. As I said before, it's an imitation carbon fiber trim. We find it on the dashboard right here, next to the infotainment system, and of course on the doors as well. In our acceleration tests out on the road, we ran from 0 to 60 in 5.2 seconds in this model. That is notably slower than the Kia Stinger. The Stinger, with a 3.3-liter twin-turbo V6, will run in about 4.6 seconds to 4.4 seconds, depending on the version that you have and whether or not you're using launch control. The Stinger is very, very quick. Now, obviously that's to be expected, because that does have a twin-turbo engine. We have considerably more torque out of that and more horsepower than the naturally aspirated V6 that we find in the Regal. I should also mention that I personally think that Kia and Hyundai are underrating the power output of that engine. When you take a look at the 0 to 60 time versus the weight figures, I have a feeling that that's what's going on there. Although the Stinger is notably faster than this, I'm not sure that the Stinger is exactly competition to the Regal GS. A lot of you on Facebook have been asking me about that, and I think the personality of the two vehicles is a little bit different, even though the price tag and the overall form factor is similar. When this is compared against its more natural competition, like the Lexus ES or the Acura TLX or even the Infiniti Q50 with the 3.0T engine in it, this does very well. Another thing that a lot of you on Facebook have been asking me is about this 9-speed automatic transmission. No, this is not the 9-speed that we find in the Acura TLX. It is not the 9-speed that we find in Jaguar Land Rover products or in FCA products. This is a clean sheet General Motors design. And as such, it drives very differently and much more polished than that ZF design. There have been a lot of complaints about that transmission. It's all down to the way that that transmission was designed and what it was designed for. The ZF 9-speed that we find in those other vehicles, like the Acura, has a very, very low first gear and a very, very tall 9th gear. That helps improve acceleration and it helps improve fuel economy. But on the downside, shift quality suffers. This transmission's compromise was that it doesn't have that broad of a range. So 9th gear in this transmission versus first gear, that delta is much narrower. It actually is more similar to the 8-speed automatic that we find in a number of other front-wheel drive and transverse applications. With that out of the way, let's get back to the numbers. In our 60 to 0 braking test, this model took 121 feet to stop from 60 miles an hour back to 0. That is notably longer than the last Kia Stinger that we tested. In terms of overall sporty dynamics, that is the big difference between this and the Kia. This is honestly not going to be as sporty. And it seems to be obvious from the overall design of the vehicle that it wasn't really designed to be direct competition either. We don't find shift paddles on the back of the steering wheel, which I really think is a pity. I wish this transmission had paddles, because if you're starting to drive this vehicle hard out on your favorite winding mountain road, it would be a lot better if I could control the gear like I can in some of the competition. But we don't find that in this vehicle. The stopping distances are longer, the acceleration distances are longer, and because of the tire choice that Buick made for this particular vehicle, handling is not as good either. And the difference is not close. It actually is fairly marked between this and the Stinger. In terms of overall grip, this is much closer to something like the Lincoln MKZ, the Acura TLX, and the Lexus ES than the Kia Stinger. Driving dynamics are also very different. We do have a torque vectoring rear axle in this vehicle, and that helps this handle more like an Acura TLX or actually an Audi A5, but the Stinger is a near balanced vehicle, and it also has a rear wheel power bias, so overall driving dynamics are always going to be different than this. Like the Lincoln, the Lexus, and the Acura, the majority of this vehicle's weight is over the front axle. It's right around 60 or 62% or so. In addition to that, this drivetrain's default is to send most of its power to the front axle. Unlike the Kia Stinger or a BMW or a Mercedes, this vehicle cannot disconnect the front axle from the equation. It can either choose to connect the rear axle and send power to the back, or it can choose to disconnect that and leave power up front. That's very different than what we see in those European entries, because those default to sending power to the rear, and then they can disconnect the front axle or reconnect it whenever they want. That's quite a different thing than what we see here. Now, to help compensate for that a little bit, very much like we see in Acura Super Handling all-wheel drive, Buick sticks a torque vectoring rear axle in the rear. Buick does not appear to be overdriving the rear axle in the same way that Acura does with super handling all-wheel drive, so this vehicle can't send quite as much power to the rear axle. And that is noticeable when you start driving this harder out on the road. In corners, this vehicle will lock the center coupling, which sends, in theory, about 50% of the power to the rear axle. Then it will send that entire 50% to a single rear wheel. That's why we call that torque vectoring. That helps you get around that corner. It also gives the vehicle more of a rear wheel drive feel. However, to experience that feel, you generally have to drive the vehicle pretty hard, and you have to be really on the throttle in a corner. So when we get to this corner right here, you really have to be on the throttle in order to get that torque vectoring feel and have it pull you around the corner like we see in the Acura TLX. And that's where the lack of paddle shifters, I think, is really a problem for this vehicle. Like the Acura TLX, the moment you've lifted off that throttle, it's going to feel more like a front-heavy vehicle, because it is, of course. So that means in neutral handling situations, if I'm just carrying speed through this corner, it's not going to turn as sharply as the average rear-wheel drive vehicle. And that is one of the disadvantages of systems like this or the Acura super handling all-wheel drive system. Now, on the flip side, this is going to feel much more engaging than the all-wheel drive system that we find in the Lincoln MKZ or the Lincoln Continental. In some ways, this will feel dynamically a little bit like an Audi A5 or an S5, because those vehicles carry more of their weight on the front axle as well, due to the overall design of Audi's Quattro system. However, they're not front power biased vehicles like this. They actually are rear power biased vehicles. So they can connect or disconnect the front axle, but the rear axle is always in the equation. Because of that, the Audi does not need a torque vectoring rear axle to give you that lively rear end. And that's basically the same thing that we see in the Kia Stinger, the BMW, the Mercedes, etc. At higher speeds, the Kia Stinger does have some rear end lift that we don't see in the Buick, but overall it is still going to grip the road much better than this. With all of that put together, I'm going to give this a B+ when it comes to overall handling in this segment, because there are so many different vehicles that you could compare this to. Adaptive suspensions have really changed the demeanor of vehicles like the Buick Regal, the Kia Stinger, and other vehicles in this particular segment. Adaptive suspensions cannot alter everything about a suspension's dynamics. They can really just adjust the damping. But it does mean that you can have a firmer suspension when you want one and a softer suspension when you want one. When this suspension is in its default mode, we definitely get a comfortable highway ride, and a ride that definitely soaks up large and small imperfections alike out here on this gravel road. But I can always move this into GS mode or Sport mode if I want to firm things up. And the difference is instantly noticeable. Now that I'm in GS mode, I can definitely feel all the small imperfections on this road surface. Although I have to say, this suspension still does an excellent job of soaking up large bumps like speed bumps or major potholes out on the road. Although you will find a slightly more polished ride in something like a Lexus ES, which I would say is competition to the Regal in some ways, I'm going to give this overall an A when it comes to our ride score. When it comes to our cabin noise score, I'm going to give this an A because we recorded 70 decibels at 50 miles an hour, making this easily one of the quieter vehicles in this particular segment. Buicks have long been known for their quiet cabins, and this vehicle is no different. In our fuel economy tests, we've been averaging 21 miles per gallon over a week of mixed driving, which puts this just a little bit below what the EPA says we should get, and in pretty direct competition with most of the all-wheel drive V6 competitors. If you want one of the more efficient options in this segment, then something like the Audi A5 would be a good alternative, because fuel economy is surprisingly high in that vehicle thanks to its dual clutch transmission and the efficient 2-liter turbo. I spoke to a few people this week that seemed a little bit disappointed when they took the Regal GS out for a drive, but I have to say I'm not one of them. I really like the way the GS is tuned overall. I wish the steering had a little bit more feel, and I really wish this vehicle had shift paddles. But I think overall this is a very well packaged vehicle. The transmission is an excellent partner, the V6 engine has a nice sound to it, acceleration is definitely respectable in this segment, and the addition of the torque vectoring rear axle is a novelty that we don't see in some of its direct competitors. Buick's Regal spans a price range that makes comparisons a little bit tricky. It starts at $25,070 for the base 2-liter turbo model. That's actually about $5,000 less than an Accord with their 2-liter turbo, and about $7,000 less than a Kia Stinger 2.0T. The Regal is low enough that it's really only about a $2,500 jump above a base Accord or Camry. Theoretically, Buick as a brand is positioned as a premium brand or a near luxury brand, whatever you want to call the nebulous region between a mainstream brand like Toyota and a luxury brand like Lexus. There aren't that many players in this premium segment, but arguably Buick and Acura are two of them. That stuck in the middle position means that the Buick Regal is going to be priced within the range of a Toyota Camry as well as a Lexus ES. It's going to be priced within the range of a Honda Accord and, surprisingly enough, almost exactly within the range of the Acura TLX, because the TLX is in this same mini segment as well. But it's definitely going to be less expensive than something like a BMW or an Audi. That's obvious if you want more of the luxury trappings that you'd expect in a competitor to, for instance, the Lexus ES or Acura TLX. The price tag would then jump up to about $33,000 for the Essence trim, which is right where the Acura TLX starts, and the top-end GS trim starts at $39,995. That price tag is basically the same as a comparable Acura TLX and basically the same as a base Lexus ES350. But if you add everything to your GS, you'll end up at around $45,000, which is where the Acura TLX also ends, but definitely below the Lexus ES, an Audi A5, the BMW 4 Series, etc. With that out of the way, let's dive into our first competitor, and really the most direct and truest competitor of all, the Acura TLX. The TLX is a traditional sedan, not a liftback like we see in the Buick. The Acura is an awful lot of fun, and I really like the way the TLX looks. I think it actually is very attractive, both inside the cabin and outside the cabin. But compared against the Buick, the Acura is not quite as comfortable. I would actually argue that in some ways it's not quite as refined either. I do find the interior to be better in the Acura, but the overall drivetrain refinement and driving experience I think is actually a little bit better in the Regal. Now the Regal's not going to handle quite as well as the Acura TLX, but I think it is going to feel more refined out on the road. We get that adaptive suspension, which I think is really handy, and the transmission is considerably smoother than the ZF 9-speed that we find in the Acura. In terms of overall performance, the Acura and the Buick are actually very, very similar with one another. They both have naturally aspirated V6 engines. They both have torque vectoring rear axles. But the Acura has the ability of sending more than 50% of engine power to the rear when the front axle is not slipping. Both of them will send more than 50% to the rear if the front axle slips, but if the front axle isn't slipping, the Acura can still send more to the rear than we see in the Buick. Other advantages that the Buick has over the Acura TLX are that enormous cargo area in the back. We also get more rear seat room, even though we have that more sloping profile in the Buick. It's also worth noting that you're likely going to get a better deal on the Regal at the Buick dealer than on the TLX at the Acura dealer. So even though the MSRPs are basically identical when comparably equipped, you're probably going to be out the door less in the Buick than in the Acura. Now let's see how the Buick does when pitted against a mainstream entry, the Honda Accord, which you could also sort of logically see as the mainstream version of the Acura TLX. This is an interesting comparison here because the Accord feels fresher and sharper. It is a little bit newer than the Regal, but the Regal actually manages to be less expensive than some trims of the Honda Accord, so it's arguably going to be a better value, especially in the base trim. If you've been looking at a Honda Accord and you're a little sad that it doesn't offer all-wheel drive or a V6 engine, those could be other reasons that you might want to get the Buick instead. We also have that enormous trunk. Now, the Honda Accord does not use the same 9-speed automatic transmission that the Acura TLX uses. It actually uses Honda's new 10-speed automatic. And that new 10-speed automatic, I think, is actually a slightly nicer transmission than what we see in the Buick. The shifts seem a little bit faster. It also has a broader ratio spread, so first gear is a little bit more aggressive. Top gear is a little bit higher to give you better fuel economy. That aggressive first gear is really obvious when you take a look at the 0 to 60 performance figures, because even though the Accord doesn't have as much power as the Regal GS, overall performance-wise, it actually slots between the 2-liter turbo version of the Regal and the 3.6-liter version of the Regal because it has that very, very aggressive first gear. The Accord also has a few touches inside the cabin that we don't see available on the Regal, but the Regal compensates for that with its available all-wheel drive system, which we don't see on the Accord, and again, that bigger cargo area. But keep in mind that top-end trims of the Regal will cost you more than an Accord, although again, you're likely going to get a slightly better deal on the Buick at the Buick dealer than the Accord at the Honda dealer, so some of that might even out. It's still likely going to be more expensive, however. Next up, we have the comparison that I was most asked about over at facebook.com/AlexonAutos. In some ways, the Stinger is the most obvious competitor, but not necessarily the most logical competitor, because the Stinger is just a very different kind of vehicle. The Stinger is more expensive, especially in base version versus the base version of the Regal, although you get much more feature content in the Stinger than we find in that base Regal. By the time you work your way on up to the top, The Stinger is, again, considerably more expensive than the Buick, but you get more in the Stinger than you get in the Buick. We get more performance, we get better handling ability, we get a better handling feel. We also, I think, have an interior that is put together a little bit better than the Regal as well, but it's still going to cost you more, and we keep having to come back to that. Comparing the Stinger to the Buick Regal is a bit like comparing the Audi A5 Sportback or a BMW 4 Series Grand Coupe to the Regal. Yes, the Regal is going to be a better value, but it's not necessarily going to be the better vehicle. What makes that interesting, of course, is that that is basically the same argument that we have with the Stinger versus the Audi A5 or a BMW 4 Series, but in a way the capability of the Stinger, because it's rear-wheel drive and it does have excellent handling dynamics, actually pushes it closer to those luxury brands than we see out of the Buick. Because of the overall pricing structure of the Regal, it's actually a little bit more logical to compare it against the Fusion rather than the Lincoln MKZ. You can really tell that when you take a look at the Fusion 2-liter EcoBoost SE, for instance. It actually is more expensive at $27,875 than the base 2-liter engine that we find in the Regal. Although it is important to keep in mind that that 2-liter EcoBoost SE does come with all-wheel drive. And if you want the least expensive version of the Regal with all-wheel drive, that actually bumps the price up considerably to $32,695. But if you just want the 2-liter turbo and its improved performance, then you're actually going to find that at a lower price in the Buick than in the Ford Fusion. The Fusion's also an appropriate option because it has an available 2.7-liter twin-turbo V6. And on paper, that 2.7-liter twin-turbo sounds like an awful lot of fun. We get about 15 horsepower more than we get in the Buick and nearly 100 pound-feet of torque more. Now, on the downside, the Fusion routes that power through a 6-speed automatic transmission that can't handle the kind of power that the 9-speed can handle in the Buick. And therefore, it actually doesn't manage to be that much faster than the Buick. The difference is only 1/10 of a second, 0 to 60. So they're essentially identical because that's likely within the margin of error for our testing here at Alex on Autos. The reason that happens is because the Ford 6-speed automatic can't handle all that torque in first gear, so it is severely limited in terms of its actual power output in first gear. It doesn't actually produce that maximum rated power and torque in first gear. And by the time first gear is done and it is producing all that oomph, a lot of the acceleration advantage has really left. The Fusion handles really well, and it is still one of the most attractive mid-size sedans you can buy. I think it is definitely more attractive than the Buick Regal in my opinion. Be sure and let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below. But because of the older design of the Fusion, it doesn't necessarily handle better than the Buick, and the trunk is considerably smaller than the Regal as well. The back seats in the Fusion are also a little bit smaller than the Regal. Now, Ford measures their legroom a little bit differently than some manufacturers out there, so keep that in mind when you take a look at the legroom figures. But really, in the real world, the legroom is more generous in the Regal, and headroom is actually a little bit more generous as well. Bottom line, the Regal really is an interesting tweener vehicle here. This could be the Goldilocks just right vehicle for some, or it could feel like it's a little bit too on one side or too on the other. It really depends on exactly what you're looking for, and that's why comparisons are a little bit tricky in this premium or near luxury group. It's obvious that especially the lower end trims of the Regal GS with the 2-liter turbo engine are really good buys versus mainstream midsize sedans if you're looking for a little bit of extra style, a lot more cargo capacity, and a little bit more power under the hood. That's a really good combo. But compared against the brand new 2019 Lexus ES, it's not as refined as that particular front-wheel drive model. And versus something like a Kia Stinger, it's not as refined and not as much fun. But both of those vehicles will be considerably more expensive. So that is an important thing to keep in mind, and that really is the value proposition that we see in the Buick Regal, and that's why it has really intrigued me. I really like the Buick Regal, but if I'm going to have to choose among the vehicles in this segment, I would say I would take the Regal over the Ford Fusion. I would take the Regal over something like a Chevy Malibu. But would I take the Regal over the Honda Accord? That really depends on what exactly you're after. If you're after that bigger cargo area at the back or base performance, then I would. But I really like the top end trim of the Accord. It really is a very well put together package, but it doesn't have all-wheel drive like we find in the Buick. Now, would I buy the Buick Regal or a Kia Stinger? I think that's easy. I would buy the Kia Stinger over the Regal, but you have to be able to have pockets that are a little bit deeper. Well, again, let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below. Find us over at facebook.com/AlexOnAutos if you haven't already done so. Be sure and click up there to the top of your screen if you want to support this channel. That'll take you over to patreon.com, and I'll see you next week.